They made her scrub floors, empty bedpans, restock supply closets while real nurses handled real patients. She was 30 years old, dressed in faded blue scrubs 2 sizes too big, and every single doctor at Crest Haven Regional Medical Center in Durango, Colorado treated her like she was furniture. Invisible. Replaceable. A nursing student who should be grateful just to be allowed inside the building. But the night 3 black military SUVs screamed into the emergency bay and 4 Navy SEALs carried in a dying man, the team leader stopped cold in the middle of the hallway, looked straight at her, and said a name nobody in that hospital had ever heard. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because we drop stories like this every week and you do not want to miss what happens next. And while you're at it, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, so let me know where you are, and let's get into it. The first thing people noticed about Sara Whitfield was that she apologized too much. Not in an obvious way. Not the kind of constant, frantic sorry that made everyone uncomfortable. It was quieter than that. A half step back when someone walked too close. A slight dip of the chin when a doctor passed her in the hallway without acknowledging her. The way she'd wait an extra beat before speaking, as if she needed to calculate whether her words were worth the air they'd use. She'd been at Crest Haven Regional Medical Center for 4 months, and in that time she had become something the hospital was surprisingly good at producing, a person nobody saw. Durango was a mid-sized city that liked to think of itself as serious, the kind of place that had 1 good hospital, 2 mediocre coffee shops, and a local news station that covered everything with the same breathless urgency, whether it was a county budget shortfall or a fender bender on Route 160. Crest Haven sat on the north edge of town, a 4-story building of pale brick and tinted glass that looked more corporate than medical, and operated, Sara had come to understand, with exactly that priority in mind. She arrived at 6:45 every morning, 15 minutes before her shift officially started, because showing up on time was apparently not the same as showing up ready, and the charge nurse, a woman named Donna Price, who had worked at Crest Haven for 19 years and treated every nursing student as a personal inconvenience, had made that distinction clear on Sara's first day. "You're not here to learn," Donna had told her, not unkindly, just flatly, the way someone states a policy rather than an opinion. "You're here to not get in the way. If you can manage that, we'll get along fine." Sara had said, yes, of course, and had meant it, and had spent the next 4 months doing exactly that. She changed linens. She restocked supply carts. She ran lab samples to the 3rd floor when the pneumatic tube system backed up, which it did 3 or 4 times a week because Crest Haven's facilities budget had not kept pace with its billing department. She sat in on procedures when she was allowed to and took notes when she wasn't, and asked questions only when she was certain the timing wouldn't irritate anyone. The other students in her cohort complained about the treatment constantly. They gathered in the break room and aired grievances over bad vending machine coffee, ranking the attendings by how condescending they were, trading stories about the worst things anyone had said to them that week. Sara listened and nodded and occasionally offered a sympathetic sound, but she never contributed her own material, partly because she didn't want to seem dramatic, mostly because the things that happened to her on any given shift would have dominated the conversation in a way that felt uncomfortable. Last Tuesday, for example. Dr. Marcus Brill, chief of emergency medicine, silver-haired, perpetually tan in the way of men who have expensive hobbies, had asked Sara to step out of the trauma bay during a patient assessment because, and she was quoting him directly, "Students observe from the gallery or they don't observe at all, and frankly, I'd prefer the latter." The patient in question had been a 62-year-old man with a suspected tension pneumothorax, and Sara had recognized the deviation of the trachea before any of the 3 residents in the room had mentioned it. She had started to say something, and Brill had looked at her the way you look at a car alarm going off 3 blocks away, acknowledging the sound, dismissing the cause, and then turned back to his residence as if she had already left. She had left. She'd stood in the hallway outside the trauma bay for 40 seconds, listening to the residents work through the assessment, hearing them reach the same conclusion she'd reached 4 minutes earlier, and then she'd gone to restock the supply cart on the 2nd floor because it was either that or stand there doing nothing useful, and she didn't know how to do nothing. That was the thing about Sara Whitfield that nobody at Crest Haven understood because nobody at Crest Haven had bothered to look. She had never in her adult life been able to do nothing when something needed doing. It was not a virtue. It was almost a compulsion, and it had cost her things she still couldn't think about directly without the thought sliding sideways into something she wasn't ready to face. She was 31 years old. She had a nursing student ID badge, a studio apartment 6 blocks from the hospital, and a go-bag packed under her bed out of a habit she hadn't been able to break. She ate the same breakfast every morning, 2 eggs, toast, black coffee, not because she particularly liked it, but because consistent small routines kept the larger machinery of her brain running without too much friction. Her name, before it was Sara Whitfield, had been something else. She didn't think about that on most days. She was good at not thinking about it. Years of practice. The thing about patterns is that once you start seeing them, you can't stop. Sara noticed the first one 6 weeks into her placement at Cresthaven. A 47-year-old woman named, according to the chart Sara had been asked to file, Margaret Osei, admitted with acute abdominal pain. Initial workup suggested appendicitis, possibly complicated. And then, without any notation Sara could find explaining the clinical reasoning, Margaret Osei had been transferred to a facility in Pueblo before a surgical consult could be completed. The discharge paperwork was thin. The transfer authorization had been signed by someone whose signature Sara couldn't fully read, and when she'd asked Donna Price about the proper protocol for documenting inter-facility transfers, Donna had given her a look that was not quite hostile but was several steps past neutral. "That's above your pay grade, hun." Sara had filed the paperwork and said nothing. 3 weeks later, she was returning a chart to the filing station on the second floor when she noticed a discrepancy in a medication log. A patient named Jerome Ashby, 64, post-cardiac procedure. His medication record showed a dosage adjustment at 11:15 p.m. But the attending physician's signature on the adjustment order, Dr. Brill's signature, had a timestamp of 11:42 p.m., which meant either the medication had been changed before it was authorized or the timestamps had been altered afterward. Sara stood in the hallway for a long moment, holding the chart. She filed it. She said nothing. But she started keeping her own records. Not formal documentation, nothing that could be construed as official or accusatory. Just a small notebook, spiral-bound, dark green, the kind sold in 3-packs at any drugstore, in which she wrote dates, patient initials, discrepancy types, and the names of whoever had signed the relevant paperwork. She kept it in the inside pocket of her oversized scrub top, which she'd chosen for exactly this reason. The pockets were large and the fit was shapeless enough that nobody could see what she was carrying. She was not investigating anything. She was just paying attention. That's what she told herself. The problem with telling yourself that is that attention, sustained over time, tends to produce conclusions. By her 3rd month at Cresthaven, Sara's notebook had 41 entries. She had cross-referenced them against the public patient registry, available to clinical staff, including students, for care coordination purposes, and identified a pattern that was not random and was not the result of individual clerical errors. High-acuity patients, predominantly those with complex presentations requiring extended and expensive care, were being transferred out of Cresthaven at a rate significantly above regional average. Transfers were being authorized by a narrow rotation of senior staff, with Dr. Brill and the hospital's chief administrator, a woman named Lorraine Sykes, whose office was on the 4th floor and who Sara had seen exactly 3 times, always moving fast, always on the phone, appearing in the authorization chain more often than probability would suggest. The medication log discrepancies, Sara had found 15 of them by now, followed a pattern of correction rather than error, as if someone was going back into records and adjusting numbers to align with outcomes rather than documenting what had actually been administered. She didn't know exactly what this meant yet, but she knew that it was not nothing. The question was what to do with it, and she was still working on that question when the morning that changed everything started in the most ordinary possible way. What? It was a Wednesday. Early November. The kind of Colorado morning that looked deceptively calm from inside. Pale blue sky, frost on the parking lot asphalt, the peaks of the La Plata Mountains, visible to the northwest in the cold, clear air, and bit down hard the moment you stepped outside. Sara arrived at 6:43, changed into her scrubs in the locker room, checked the board. Her assignment for the morning was 3rd floor general medical ward, which meant bed checks and vital signs, and whatever the charge nurse needed done quickly, so that the actual nurses could focus on the things that required actual nursing. She had been at it for about 2 hours. Nothing unusual, a quiet morning so far. One patient complaining about his breakfast tray, and another asking for a blanket she'd found for him in the linen closet down the hall. When Donna Price appeared at the nurse's station with the particular expression she used when delivering bad news she was personally enjoying. "Whitfield, Dr. Holt wants to see you." Dr. Alan Holt was Cresthaven's Director of Clinical Education, which meant he was technically responsible for the nursing students, and also, in practice, had very little interest in them unless something had gone wrong. Sara had met him twice. Both times he'd looked at her the way people look at something they're trying to remember the name of. She followed Donna down the hallway and into the small office suite near the administrative wing. Dr. Holt was sitting behind his desk. Lorraine Sykes was standing near the window, which Sara registered as unusual before she registered anything else. The chief administrator didn't generally attend meetings about nursing students. "Close the door," Holt said. Sara closed it. "We've had a report," he said, "that a student accessed restricted patient records without authorization. Medical history files, transfer documentation, files that a student at your clearance level has no business looking at." He had a folder in front of him that he hadn't opened yet. Sara looked at it and felt something in her chest go very still. "I haven't accessed any restricted files," she said. "That's not what the system log shows." "Then the system log is wrong." Lorraine Sykes spoke from the window, and her voice had the texture of something that had been polished smooth over many years of practice. "Sara, nobody is accusing you of anything at this stage. We simply need to understand why your access credentials were used to pull transfer authorization records from the past 90 days. I pull patient files for care coordination. That's part of the student rotation protocol. Transfer authorization files aren't part of the student rotation protocol. Some of them were attached to patient charts I was asked to." "Sara." Holt's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Your access has been suspended pending review. You're to leave the clinical floors until we've completed an investigation. You can use the time to review whether you want to continue your placement here, because honestly, this kind of—" He paused, choosing a word. "Curiosity tends to be a poor fit for the Cresthaven environment." Sara looked at him, then at Lorraine Sykes. Sykes was watching her with an expression that was perfectly calibrated, concerned, professional, not unkind, and behind it, Sara could see nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. "I'd like to file a formal response," Sara said. "Of course. You can do that in writing to my office." Holt stood up, which was apparently the end of the meeting. "Leave your badge with Donna on your way out." She walked to the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs. She put her street clothes back on, jeans, a gray thermal, her jacket, and sat on the bench between the lockers for 4 minutes doing nothing, which was unusual for her, and which she allowed herself because she didn't trust what she might do if she started moving before she'd thought through what came next. Her notebook was in the inside pocket of her scrub top. She transferred it to her jacket. She thought about the 41 entries. She thought about Margaret Osei, transferred out with incomplete surgical workup, about Jerome Ashby's backdated medication order, about the 16 other patients whose records had small, careful discrepancies that no individual reviewer would flag, but that, taken together, told a story about a hospital that was not primarily in the business of treating the patients it found most difficult or expensive to treat. She thought about Lorraine Sykes standing by the window with nothing behind her eyes. The thing about growing up in a system, any system, military or medical or otherwise, was that you learned to recognize when the machinery was being used against you. The specificity of the accusation, the speed of the response, the presence of the administrator. They hadn't suspended her access because they thought she'd done something wrong. They'd suspended her access because they knew she'd found something right. She stood up, shouldered her bag. The system log discrepancy they'd cited, her credentials used to pull transfer authorization files, wasn't something she'd done from any terminal she'd logged into, which meant someone else had used her access, which meant they had her login credentials and had used them deliberately to create exactly the paper trail that would justify removing her from the building before she could do anything with what she knew. It was neat. She had to admit it was neat. She walked out through the staff entrance and stood in the parking lot in the cold November air. And for the first time in 4 months, she let herself think, really think, the way she used to think when clear analysis was the difference between someone living and someone not, about what she was actually dealing with. The sound hit her before she'd finished the thought. Not loud at first. A low vibration, the kind you feel in your sternum before your ears fully process it, and then it resolved into the unmistakable percussion of heavy vehicles moving fast, engines pushing hard, tires against cold asphalt, the crunch of a turn taken too quickly. She turned toward the sound. 3 black SUVs came around the north corner of the parking lot in tight formation, running no sirens but moving with the kind of purposeful speed that made bystanders step back instinctively. They didn't park. They stopped. Just stopped. At angles that weren't quite random, in the ambulance bay in front of the emergency entrance, and the doors opened before the vehicles had fully settled. 4 men got out of the second vehicle. They were in civilian clothes, dark tactical pants, jackets that didn't quite conceal the deliberate way they moved. And 3 of them were carrying the 4th. Not carrying him the way you carry someone who's fallen. Carrying him the way you carry someone who has to be kept stable, has to be kept exactly right, because the alternative is something you are not going to let happen. The man being carried was big. Even in the state he was in, clearly in pain, head dropping, one arm wrapped against his torso, you could see the kind of physical architecture that gets built over years of very specific work. His face was pale under a dark beard, and even from 30 feet away, Sara could see the shallow, rapid pattern of his breathing. She started walking toward the emergency bay before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. The team leader, she clocked him as team leader by the way the others adjusted their positions relative to him, the way space organized itself around him, was the one who'd stayed upright as they moved. Tall, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had taken a few things without apologizing for any of them. He was scanning the entrance, scanning the bay, cataloging the environment the way people did when they'd been trained to assume that everything might matter. His eyes swept across the emergency bay, across the nurses running out to meet them, across the orderly with the gurney, across Dr. Brill, who had appeared with the particular energy of someone who wanted to be seen managing a situation. And then his eyes reached Sara, who had stopped at the edge of the ambulance lane. He went completely still. Not the still of someone who's pausing to think, the still of someone who's just processed something that reoriented everything else. Sparrow. He said it the way you say a name you weren't expecting to need. The sound hit Sara like cold water, not painful, not frightening, but immediate and total in the way physical sensation overrides everything else for a fraction of a second. She hadn't heard that name in 3 years. She'd spent 3 years making sure she wouldn't hear it again. Dr. Brill was saying something about the trauma bay, about protocol, about capacity, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any given room. The team leader wasn't listening to him. He was looking at Sara. And Sara Whitfield, who apologized too much, who kept her head down, who had spent 4 months making herself as invisible as a person could manage while still showing up every day, felt something she'd worked very hard to keep buried shift in her chest. Loosen. Come loose. She had 41 entries in a notebook and no access badge and a suspended placement and nowhere to be. The man they were carrying was going to die if someone didn't make the right calls in the next several minutes. And she could see from here, from 30 feet away, without any equipment, purely from the color of his skin and the mechanics of his breathing, exactly what was wrong with him, and exactly what needed to happen, and exactly in what order. She took a step forward. "What's his pulse ox?" she said. Her voice came out level, clear. It did not sound like a nursing student's voice. The team leader didn't hesitate. Last check was 81, dropping. She was already moving, and the team parted for her without being asked, which told her everything she needed to know about what the team leader had already communicated to them in the half-second before she'd started walking. The man on the gurney, she'd sort out his name later, names came after stabilization, was large enough that the orderly was struggling to keep the wheels tracking straight as they pushed through the emergency bay doors. Sara moved alongside him, her eyes doing the fast, automatic survey that she'd spent years training herself out of needing to think about. Skin color wrong, breathing pattern wrong. The way his left hand kept curling and releasing against the gurney rail, which he probably wasn't aware of, which meant the pain was somewhere his body was trying to compensate for without his conscious direction. "What happened?" she said. The team leader was right beside her. "Training exercise, live fire. Something went wrong with the extraction. We think he took a fragment, upper left chest, but we couldn't confirm in the field. He was okay for the first 40 minutes, and then he wasn't. How long ago was the 40-minute mark? 32 minutes. So over an hour total since injury. She filed that. Any other trauma? Fall? Impact? He went down hard when it hit him, concrete surface. She looked at the man's face again. The pallor had a specific quality to it, not just blood loss pale, but the grayish tone that came when the chest cavity was doing something it shouldn't. The breathing was fast and shallow, and she watched his chest for 3 full seconds as they moved, uneven, left side lagging. Dr. Brill had materialized at the trauma bay doors with 2 residents flanking him, and his face had the expression of a man who was deciding how to reassert authority over a situation that had moved without him. "We'll take it from here," he said, and he was addressing the team leader, deliberately not looking at Sara. "She's running this," the team leader said. Brill blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me?" "She is a nursing student." Brill said it with the kind of precision that was meant to end conversations. "She has no clinical authority in this." "I don't care." The team leader's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "She has more field medical hours than everyone in this building combined, and right now I need someone I trust making decisions about my commander. So unless you're going to physically stop her, get out of the way." Brill looked at Sara, really looked at her, for possibly the first time in 4 months. She didn't look back. She was already at the patient's side, already pulling on gloves from the dispenser mounted to the bay wall, already talking to the respiratory therapist who'd appeared with an O2 setup. "Start him at 15 liters, non-rebreather. I need a portable chest x-ray in here now, and I need a chest tray setup. 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Don't wait for the film." The respiratory therapist looked at Brill. Brill's jaw tightened. "Do what she says," he said, and it cost him something to say it, but he said it, and that was the end of that particular argument. Well, what happened in the next 22 minutes was not smooth. It was not the kind of emergency medicine that gets depicted in television dramas, where everyone moves in choreographed arcs and the right equipment appears at the right moment, and the patient's numbers climb steadily upward on a clean monitor screen. It was loud, and it was crowded, and at one point one of the residents knocked a tray, and a bowl of saline solution hit the floor and spread across the tiles, and someone swore, and someone else almost slipped in it. The patient, she learned his name was Daniel Voss, 43, when the team leader gave her his emergency information card, had a tension pneumothorax developing on the left side. She'd been right about that from the parking lot, which was not something she was proud of so much as relieved about, because being right in this case meant she'd moved fast enough. She performed the needle decompression herself, felt the rush of air that confirmed the diagnosis, watched his O2 saturation begin its climb from 81 back towards something livable, and then talked the senior resident, a young woman named Torres, who was clearly competent and clearly terrified, through placing the chest tube that would hold things stable until they could get Voss to a surgical suite. She didn't take over Torres's hands. She talked her through it, step by step, not in the soothing cadence of reassurance, but in the flat, direct rhythm of technical instruction, the way you talk to someone through a procedure when there was no time for anything except information. "Rotate 10 degrees toward you. There. Now advance slowly. You'll feel resistance. Push through it. There. Stop. Good. Fix it there." Torres fixed it. Voss's breathing evened out. Not fixed. Stabilized. There was a difference, and Sara was careful not to confuse the two even internally, because confusing them led to the specific kind of overconfidence that killed people. She stepped back and looked at the monitor. Pulse ox at 94 and climbing, heart rate coming down from 118. Blood pressure still lower than she wanted, but trending in the right direction. She pulled her gloves off. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady the whole time, which was something she didn't examine too closely because examining it led to the other memories, the ones she'd filed under things she was not dealing with today. Brill was standing at the edge of the bay. He hadn't left. He'd watched the entire thing without speaking, which was, Sara had to acknowledge, more professional than she might have expected from him. "He needs surgery," she said to the room in general. "The chest tube will hold him for now, but there's still a fragment in there and the left lobe took some damage. He needs a thoracic surgeon in the next 2 hours, not 4. "We don't have thoracic surgery on staff tonight," Torres said. "Call Mercy West in Farmington. They have a thoracic team. Get him transferred when he's stable enough to move, probably 90 minutes if his pressure holds. She paused. And document everything. Every step, every timestamp, in sequence. Don't let anyone change anything after the fact. She said the last part without particular emphasis. She said it the same way she'd said everything else. But she felt the team leader, who had been standing just inside the bay doors the entire time, register it. His name was Cal Merritt. She didn't know that yet when he followed her into the hallway after she'd handed Voss's monitoring over to Torres and the respiratory team. She'd washed her hands at the bay sink and was standing in the corridor doing the thing she always did after an acute situation. Just standing, not thinking about anything specific, letting the adrenaline find its own way down. When he appeared beside her. "That was you," he said. She didn't answer because it wasn't quite a question. 3 years ago, he said, outside Kandahar, the convoy. She looked at the wall in front of her. "You were at Kandahar?" "I wasn't, but Voss was. He told us about the medic who ran the whole thing. 2 vehicles down, 4 serious casualties, no backup for 6 hours. He paused. Said she was Air Force. Said she was the reason 3 of his guys made it back with all their parts. Sara had not thought about that day in approximately 8 months, which was a record of sorts. She thought about it now and then set it back down where she'd found it. "Different person," she said. "You said needle decompression, second intercostal, mid-clavicular, without looking at the film. That's the standard approach. The film confirmed left-sided tension pneumo. You'd called it from the parking lot." He was quiet for a moment. "What's your name, your real name?" "Sara Whitfield." "Okay," he said. "Okay, is that your real name?" She finally looked at him. He had the face of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors in weather and hadn't particularly tried to protect it from any of it. And his eyes were the kind of dark gray that made it hard to tell what he was thinking, which she suspected was intentional, or at least had been at some point, and had become habitual. "It's my name," she said. He seemed to decide to accept that for now. "I'm Cal Merritt. I run the team." "I know." "How?" "The way everyone moved relative to you." He looked at her for another moment. "Voss is going to want to thank you." "He should thank Torres. She placed the tube." "You're going to be difficult about this." "I'm going to be accurate about this." Something shifted slightly in his expression, not quite a smile, but in the general neighborhood. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." "Ask." "When you told them to document everything and not let anyone change it after the fact, what did you mean by that?" She considered him. He'd asked it carefully, which told her he'd heard the specificity of what she'd said and had understood it was not a routine instruction. He was not unintelligent. She'd already known that from the way he'd managed the Bay situation, the economy of it, the way he'd neutralized Brill with 5 words and not wasted any additional energy on him. "It means what it sounds like," she said. "This hospital has a documentation problem?" "I've been suspended from my placement here. I don't think I should be characterizing the hospital." "You were suspended." "About an hour ago, yes." "For what?" "For accessing records I apparently wasn't supposed to access." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, "Were you?" "I was accessing them because they had discrepancies that affected patient safety. Whether that means I wasn't supposed to access them depends on who you ask." "What kind of discrepancies?" She looked at him. He looked back. In the bay behind them, she could hear the steady, reassuring percussion of Voss's monitor and the low voices of Torres's team maintaining the work she'd set in motion. "The kind," she said, "that a nursing student probably shouldn't be describing to a member of a military unit she just met, whose presence here is presumably classified." "Our presence here is complicated," he said. "Voss's injury happened during a federal training exercise. That makes the incident subject to federal review." "And does federal review include the hospital where he was treated?" Cal Merritt looked at her with the expression of someone recalculating something they thought they'd already figured out. "Tell me about the records," he said. She told him in the hallway, standing up, in approximately 12 minutes, which was how long she estimated they had before someone from hospital administration appeared to address the situation. She'd seen Lorraine Sykes in the building when they'd come in from the bay, a brief glimpse through the administrative wing doorway, and Sykes was not the kind of person who sat with a situation longer than she had to. Sara told him about the transfers, the medication log discrepancies, the the pattern of documentation alteration that she'd traced across 41 patient files. She told him about Margaret Osei and Jerome Ashby by initials because she wasn't going to use patient names with someone she'd known for 15 minutes. She told him about the specific mechanism, the way the alterations were not random errors but corrections, small adjustments that reconciled paperwork to outcomes rather than documenting what had actually occurred. She did not show him the notebook. Not yet. He listened without interrupting. He did the thing that good tactical people did when they were receiving critical information. He went very still, not passive but concentrated, and she could see him organizing what she was telling him the way you organize terrain before you moved through it. When she finished, he said, "How long have you been collecting this? 3 months? And you have documentation. I have notes. Where?" She put her hand over the left pocket of her jacket, which was answer enough. "Okay," he said. "Don't show it to anyone in this building." "I wasn't planning to." "And don't go home tonight." She looked at him. He caught himself. Don't be alone tonight. Is there somewhere you can go that isn't your apartment?" "Why?" He said it plainly, which she appreciated. "Because if they suspended you an hour before we showed up, and we showed up in a situation that's going to generate federal paperwork, anyone who has something to hide is going to be moving fast right now. And if they know you have documentation, they think they've discredited me already. They'll think the suspension is enough." "Will it be?" She thought about Lorraine Sykes standing at the window with nothing behind her eyes. "No," she said. "Probably not." The hospital administration arrived in the form of Dr. Alan Holt, not Lorraine Sykes, which told Sara that Sykes was either somewhere else in the building, managing a different angle of this, or had decided that Holt was expendable enough to send first. Holt came down the corridor with the energy of a man who'd been briefed on the situation and had constructed a version of events in which he was in control of it, and he brought with him one of the hospital's security officers, a middle-aged man in a blue uniform whose expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ms. Whitfield," Holt said, stopping about 6 feet away in the manner of someone who wanted to maintain a formal distance without looking like they were doing it deliberately. "Your access has been suspended. You're not permitted in the clinical areas." "She was in the parking lot," Cal said. He'd positioned himself slightly ahead and to Sara's left, which she recognized as a deliberate geometry. "When we arrived, we requested her assistance. This hospital has qualified staff. Your qualified staff was standing in the bay doors while she performed the needle decompression. I was watching." Holt looked at Sara with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not contemptuous, not dismissive, but something harder and more specific. Assessing. She'd become, in the past 40 minutes, a different kind of problem than she'd been before, and she could see him adjusting his understanding of her in real time, which was not a comfortable thing to watch. "You'll need to leave the facility," he said. "The situation is resolved. You are not authorized to "The situation is not resolved," Cal said. "My commander is currently being stabilized in your trauma bay pending transfer. He's a federal employee injured during a federally supervised operation. His treatment and documentation fall under federal oversight, and I'm going to need to speak with someone about the evidentiary requirements for this facility's records going back 60 days. The security officer had gone very still. Holt said, "I'm not sure that's—" "I'm going to need a name," Cal said. "Someone with authority over your records department. I can make a call that gets me a court order by this afternoon, or you can give me a name and we skip that step." Holt's face did something complicated. Then he said, "I'll need to contact Ms. Sykes." "Great," Cal said. "Do that." Holt and the security officer retreated back up the corridor. Sara watched them go. "You can't actually get a court order this afternoon," she said. "No," Cal said. "But he doesn't know how long it takes." The next 3 hours were the kind of slow-motion tension that Sara had learned, in another life, to manage by staying very physically still and keeping her breathing even. Action she could handle, action she was good at. Waiting while other people made decisions that would affect her was the part she'd never gotten comfortable with, and she suspected she never would. Cal made phone calls. He made them from the corridor outside the trauma bay, speaking quietly into his phone in a way that made it clear the content was not for general hearing, and between calls he checked on Voss, who had been moved to a monitored room with Torres in attendance, and was awake enough to be asking questions that Torres was deflecting with the practiced patience of someone who'd learned early in her residency that answering a patient's questions and answering a patient's questions were two different things. Sara sat in a chair at the end of the corridor. She'd accepted a cup of coffee from a nurse who'd wordlessly handed it to her 20 minutes after the Bay situation, which she took as a small indicator that not everyone in this building was aligned with Holt and Sykes, and that was something. At roughly 2 in the afternoon, a woman Sara hadn't seen before came in through the emergency entrance. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark blazer, slacks, flat shoes that were practical in the specific way of people who expected to be on their feet in unknown terrain. And she had a badge clipped to her lapel that Sara couldn't read from where she was sitting. She went directly to Cal. They spoke for 4 minutes, and whatever they were saying, the conversation had the compressed efficiency of people who'd worked together before. Then Cal came back to Sara and crouched in front of her chair, which put him at eye level, which she noted. "That's a federal investigator from the OIG," he said. "Office of Inspector General. She's here because Voss's injury triggers an automatic review of the treatment facility." That was fast. "I called in some things." He said it without elaboration. "She needs to talk to you. About my notes. About everything. What you saw, what you documented, when." Sara looked at her coffee cup. "If I talk to her, the suspension becomes public. My placement here is finished." "Your placement here is already finished," he said, not unkindly. "The question is whether what you found ends with you or goes somewhere." She thought about Margaret Osei. 60 days in the notebook. 41 entries. The specific and careful way the records had been altered, which required not just access but authority, and not just one person but a system. "Does she know my name?" Sara said. "She knows you're a nursing student who assisted in an emergency. That's all." Sara sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, which was easier than she expected. Her hands were still steady. "Okay," she said. The investigator's name was Rhonda Park. She was approximately 45, with an economy of movement that Sara associated with people who'd learned not to waste physical energy on things that didn't require it. And she had the specific kind of patience in her face that came not from temperament, but from training. The patience of someone who had learned that the fastest way to get information was to make silence available and then let the other person fill it. She did not use the silence technique on Sara. Sara suspected she'd looked at her and correctly assessed that it wouldn't work. They found an empty consultation room off the administrative wing, which was itself interesting, Sara thought, because the administrative wing was Lorraine Sykes's territory, and Rhonda Park had walked into it without asking permission and without anyone stopping her. Sara told her everything. She was methodical about it. She organized it the way she'd organized it in her own head, chronologically first, then by pattern, then by the specific mechanism of the alterations. She used patient initials. She did not speculate beyond what she'd directly observed. When she finished, she put the notebook on the table between them. Rhonda Park picked it up, opened it to the first page, read for 30 seconds, then looked up. "These timestamps," she said, "the discrepancy between the medication change and the authorizing signature. 15 instances. The gap ranges from 12 minutes to 47 minutes. Could that be a documentation lag? Someone authorizing verbally and signing later? It could be, except that in 11 of the 15 cases, the documented outcome for the patient is different from what you'd expect based on the medication actually administered at the earlier time. If you change the records to show the medication was given after authorization, the outcomes are consistent. If you look at the actual sequence, 3 of those patients had adverse events that aren't explained by their documented medication history." Rhonda Park was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the records were changed to explain away adverse events. I'm saying the pattern is consistent with that. Not to cover individual errors, to cover a system." Sara looked at her. "To cover a practice." The investigator wrote something in her own notebook, which Sara found obscurely satisfying in a way she didn't examine. Then Rhonda Park looked up and said, "How did you find this?" "You're a nursing student. This isn't—" "I pay attention," Sara said, "and I know what medication logs are supposed to look like." "From nursing school." Sara picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Among other things." Rhonda Park studied her. Sara had the sense that the investigator was recalculating something, the same way Cal had recalculated something in the hallway, and that the calculation was arriving at a conclusion that Rhonda Park was not yet ready to state out loud. "Ms. Whitfield," she said finally, "I'm going to need you to remain available. Am I free to leave the facility?" "Yes, but I need a contact number and I need you to stay in the area." "Okay. And I need to tell you something." Rhonda Park closed the notebook, not handing it back, Sara noticed. "What you've described, if it's what it looks like, has been running for a long time. Long enough that the people involved have had a lot of practice at managing threats to it. Being suspended was the polite version of being managed." She paused. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Sara thought about Lorraine Sykes's window expression. "Yes," she said. "Good." Rhonda Park stood up, tucking the notebook, Sara's notebook, with Sara's handwriting, 41 entries, 3 months of work, into her bag. "Don't talk to anyone at this facility unless I'm present. Not Holt, not the charge nurse, nobody." "And the hospital's records?" Sara said. "The electronic files. If someone realizes what's happening, we've already requested an immediate records preservation order." A pause. "That's why I got here fast." Sara nodded. She stood, and they were the same height, which she hadn't noticed when Rhonda Park came in. She was almost to the door when the investigator said, "One more thing." Sara turned. "The man your team brought in," Rhonda Park said carefully. "Commander Voss. His injury report noted he was part of an operational unit running classified training exercises in this region." "Yes." "The injury happened at a specific location." Rhonda Park's voice was neutral, deliberate, the tone of someone presenting a fact rather than an accusation. "A location that appears on the transfer records you flagged, a property connected to a company that has a service agreement with this hospital." Sara went very still. "One of the transfers I flagged," she said. "Which one?" Rhonda Park said, "The patient with the initials M.O. Margaret Osei. Transferred out with an incomplete surgical workup, paperwork signed by an illegible name, moved before anyone with questions could ask them." "What was that location?" Sara said. "A private medical transport facility on the edge of a rural property outside Durango." Rhonda Park looked at her steadily. "A facility that has received federal contracts for emergency response services in this region." The pieces were arranging themselves in Sara's mind with the specific, terrible clarity of something she hadn't wanted to be true, becoming undeniably true anyway. The pattern of transfers, the documentation gaps, the speed with which her access had been revoked, not after months of observation, but exactly when she'd pulled records connected to that specific cluster of patients. She'd thought it was a hospital covering its mistakes. She'd thought it was about malpractice and profit margins, and the ordinary corruption of institutions that had stopped believing in their own stated purpose. She hadn't thought it was connected to anything outside the building. "How many patients," Sara said, "were transferred to that facility?" Rhonda Park said, "That's what I need to find out." She opened the consultation room door, then looked back. "Ms. Whitfield, what you found in those records, you should know that you're the first person to connect these dots in a way that created a coherent picture." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning wearing the shape of one, and Sara understood the difference. She walked back into the hallway. At the other end of the corridor, through the glass panel of the monitored room door, she could see Daniel Voss. He was awake. He was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who was doing the math on how close a thing had been. And Lorraine Sykes was standing 20 feet away, in the alcove near the elevator, speaking quietly into her phone. She had not seen Sara come out of the consultation room. Her back was partly turned, but Sara could see her profile. She could see the tension in Sykes's jaw, the quick, small movements of her free hand, pressing against her hip, releasing, pressing again. The body language of someone who was trying very hard to maintain a performance of calm, while something had gone comprehensively wrong. Sara watched her for 4 seconds. Then Sykes turned her head, not all the way, but enough, and her eyes caught Sara's across the corridor. The conversation on the phone stopped. Sykes lowered the phone. The two of them looked at each other across 20 feet of linoleum in fluorescent light, and the calculation Sara had seen behind Sykes's eyes in the office that morning, the one she'd read as contained and confident and permanently in control, had changed. There was something else there now. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific expression of someone who has just recalculated a situation and arrived at a number they didn't expect. Sara held her gaze for another second. Then she turned and walked toward the emergency exit. Behind her, she heard Sykes's voice resume, low, rapid, urgent, into the phone. She pushed through the doors into the cold afternoon air and kept walking. She kept walking until she reached the far end of the parking lot, and then she stopped because her legs had decided that was enough forward motion for the moment, and her body was doing the thing it sometimes did after sustained adrenaline, a kind of heavy, buzzing stillness, like an engine that's been running hot and is now cooling down whether you want it to or not. She stood between two parked cars and breathed. Sykes had been on the phone. Sykes had seen her. Sykes had resumed this call with the specific urgency of someone activating a contingency, and Sara had approximately enough experience with contingencies to know that the timeline between now and whatever Sykes was setting in motion was not going to be generous. She thought about what Rhonda Park had told her. A property outside Durango, a private medical transport facility with federal contracts, connected to the same cluster of patients whose records Sara had flagged. Connected now to the location where Daniel Voss had been injured. She hadn't been investigating a hospital covering malpractice. She'd been investigating the visible surface of something with much deeper roots. And the reason they'd moved fast to suspend her wasn't because she'd found evidence of documentation errors. It was because she'd found the edge of something they could not afford to have found. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered. "It's Cal. Where are you?" "Parking lot, east side." "Stay there." A pause, and she could hear movement behind him, voices, the particular acoustic texture of an institutional building. "Park needs you back inside." Sykes saw me come out of the consultation room. Silence for 2 seconds. "How bad?" "She was on the phone before I was through the door." "Okay." He said it the way people said okay when the situation had just gotten meaningfully worse, and they were recalculating out loud. "Come back in through the ambulance bay. Don't go through the main entrance." She was already moving. Well, the ambulance bay was quieter than it had been. The afternoon shift change had thinned out the emergency traffic, and the two paramedics running an intake on the far side of the bay barely glanced at her as she came through the doors. She found Cal in the corridor outside Voss's room with a second man she hadn't seen before. Younger than Cal, with the kind of face that was trying to look neutral and not quite succeeding, which told her he'd just heard something that made neutral difficult. Rhonda Park was on her phone inside Voss's room, visible through the window, pacing a short track beside the bed, while Voss watched her from the pillow with the alert, evaluating expression of a man who'd been briefed enough to understand the shape of the problem, but not all of its dimensions. "What happened?" Sara said. "The records preservation order went through," Cal said. "Hospital's electronic system flagged the request and generated an automatic administrative alert, which went to Sykes." "Which went to Sykes." He looked at the younger man beside him. "This is Marcus Webb. He runs our logistics." Marcus Webb said, 40 minutes ago, the hospital's IT system logged an administrative access event. Someone with senior credentials ran a bulk export of the transfer records from the past 6 months, including the files you flagged." Sara processed that. "They're pulling the records," she said, "or moving them, or preparing to argue that what Park has in your notebook doesn't match what's in the system, because the system will have been cleaned by the time anyone can compare them." "The preservation order covers what was in the system when the order was filed," Marcus said. "If the export happened before the order took effect, and the timestamps are going to be argued over for the next 6 months by lawyers on both sides, then what they exported may not be covered." Sara looked through the window at Rhonda Park. "She knows?" she said. "She's on with her office right now," Cal said. "They're working the timestamp problem." "That's not the only problem." Sara turned back to Cal. "The notebook. Park took it." "I know." "My handwriting, my documentation, in her bag. If Sykes is moving to discredit the records, they'll come for the notebook as fruit of the poisoned tree. Your access credentials were allegedly used without authorization. Therefore, your notes are inadmissible," Sara said it flatly, "or at least arguable, which gives them the delay they need." Cal was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," Marcus Webb said. He said it with the particular care of someone who has been rehearsing how to deliver information they don't want to deliver. "Tell me," Sara said. "The property outside Durango. The transport facility." He paused. "Our unit's operational coordinator ran a background on it this afternoon because of the Voss incident, because the injury location was flagged. The facility is registered to a shell company. The shell company traces back to a federal contractor that has active contracts with the Department of Defense for medical logistics support in this region. Sara waited. The contractor, Marcus said, has a relationship with two people on Cresthaven's board of trustees. The parking lot wasn't enough space for this information. Sara took a breath. They're not just covering malpractice, she said. No, Cal said. They're billing DoD for emergency medical response services that may not have been performed, or were performed at a fraction of the documented level. The hospital transfers are part of it. You move the patient before treatment is complete. You bill for treatment that wasn't delivered. You document the transfer as medically necessary, and nobody audits the gap because the patient's no longer in your system to contradict it. And the property where Voss was injured, Sara said slowly. It's part of the network. It has the same contractor designation, which is why he was brought here. The contractor's agreement with Cresthaven includes preferential routing of federal personnel to this facility for emergency treatment. Sara looked at the ceiling for approximately 1 second, which was as long as she allowed herself. They routed a critically injured federal employee to a hospital that was already under their control, she said. Yes. If he died in that trauma bay, the documentation would have been managed, Marcus said, same way the others were managed. Rhonda Park came out of Voss's room with her phone still in her hand and her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone operating well past the point where they'd expected to find themselves when the day started. We have a problem, she said, which Sara already knew, and then she told them what Sara already knew, which confirmed that the situation was exactly as bad as Sara had calculated. The bulk export was time-stamped 11 minutes before the preservation order took effect, Rhonda Park said. My office is pursuing emergency injunctive relief to void the export and recover the originals, but that's a court argument, and court arguments take time, Cal said, at minimum 48 hours, probably longer if their legal team files a challenge, which they will. She looked at Sara. Your notebook is the only contemporaneous documentation that exists outside their system right now. I need to know if there's anything in it that you can corroborate independently, Sara thought. 2 of the medication log discrepancies. I photographed the actual charts. With my phone, I'd pulled the charts for patient care reasons, and I saw the discrepancy, and I photographed the relevant pages before I filed them back. She paused. I didn't think I was building a legal case. You documented what you saw, Rhonda Park said. Where are the photos? My phone. Don't delete anything. Don't send them through your regular email. I'm going to give you an evidence submission link from my office's secure server. Use that. Do it now, before... She stopped. Before anything else changes. Before someone thinks to look at your phone. Sara was already pulling her phone out. Rhonda Park gave her the link. Sara found the photographs, 12 in total, taken over a period of 6 weeks, at moments when she'd been alone in the records alcove with a chart that had something wrong in it, and enough presence of mind to recognize that wrong things should be documented. She uploaded them through the secure link while standing in the corridor, which took 4 minutes and felt like 40. Done, she said. Good. Rhonda Park exhaled, which was the first unguarded physical response Sara had seen from her. That's something. That's corroborating evidence that predates any system alteration, because the metadata will show when those photographs were taken. Will it be enough? It's a start. Park's phone buzzed. She looked at it, and her expression changed. Excuse me. She moved to the end of the corridor, and the 3 of them, Sara, Cal, Marcus, stood in a cluster outside Voss's room and said nothing for a moment. Inside, Voss had turned his head and was watching them through the window. His eyes moved to Sara and stayed there. He raised his right hand slightly from the bed, not waving, just acknowledging. She returned the nod. He knows, Cal said quietly. Voss. He's been told the basics. How's his pressure? Sara said, because she couldn't stop herself. Stable. Torres said his last BP was 108/70. Still low. But holding. Cal looked at her sideways. He's not going to die. Not today, Sara said, which was the honest version of the reassurance. Rhonda Park came back with the particular quality of movement that meant the phone call had changed something. The hospital's legal counsel has filed an emergency motion to seal the records pending their own internal investigation, she said, which they're now claiming was already in progress before I arrived. They're saying they were already investigating themselves, Marcus said. They're saying they identified the documentation irregularities and initiated a review process, and that our presence here has compromised that process. Park's voice was steady, but tight. They're also filing a complaint alleging that Sarah's access to patient records was unauthorized, and that any documentation she collected is tainted. Sara had expected something like this. Expecting it didn't make it feel any better. They're going to try to make this about me, she said. They're going to try to make this about your access violations. Yes. Park looked at her directly. How confident are you in what you observed? Not what you inferred, what you directly observed. Completely. Because they're going to put you in front of a review board and ask you to justify every entry in that notebook and every photograph on your phone. And if there's anything that can be characterized as, I know what they're going to do, Sara said. I've watched institutions try to manage problems before. She said it without elaborating, and Park looked at her with the same recalculating expression she'd had before, the one that said she knew there was more to Sara Whitfield than a nursing student's ID badge. All right, Park said. Then here's where we are. I need to get Voss transferred to Mercy West tonight, not because his condition requires it, but because this facility is not a secure environment for a federal witness. He's a witness now? Cal said. He may have information about the property where he was injured that's relevant to the contractor fraud case. His status is evolving. She looked at Cal. Can your team provide escort? Yes. I need that arranged in the next 2 hours, quietly. She looked back at Sara. You're coming too. To Mercy West. You're my material witness for the documentation case. I need you where I can account for you. A pause. And frankly, I don't want you alone in this city tonight. Sara thought about her apartment 6 blocks away, the go bag under her bed, the habit she'd never broken. Okay, she said. The next 90 minutes were the kind of sustained operational tension that Sara had learned to inhabit without letting it make her careless. There was no dramatic moment, no single decision point. It was the accumulation of small logistical moves that collectively constituted getting a federal patient, a federal investigator, a material witness, and a SEAL team out of a hostile institutional environment before that environment could create enough legal friction to stop them. Torres managed Voss's transfer paperwork with a focused efficiency that surprised Sara and probably shouldn't have, given that Torres had placed a chest tube under pressure 2 hours ago. The woman was competent under duress. Sara made a mental note to say something about that at some point when there was room to say it. Marcus Webb coordinated the vehicles. 2 of the team's 3 SUVs would go with Voss. The third, and Sara's place was in it, per Cal's quiet instruction, would take a different route. It was while the team was staging the vehicles in the ambulance bay that Dr. Brill appeared. Not Holt, not Sykes. Brill, which Sara had not anticipated, and which she spent about 3 seconds processing as she tried to understand what Brill's appearance meant in terms of what the hospital's inner circle was doing. He came through the ambulance bay doors and stopped when he saw her. He was in his white coat, which he hadn't been wearing during the earlier emergency, and he had the look of a man who'd recently had a long conversation that had forced him to reassess some things. Ms. Whitfield, he said. Dr. Brill. He looked at the vehicles being staged, at Cal's team moving with quiet purpose around the bay. His jaw moved. The patient, he said. Commander Voss. He's being transferred. Yes. Is he? Brill stopped, tried again. His condition. Is he stable enough for transfer? His last BP was 108/70. Torres is managing him well. She paused. Why? Brill looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't expected. Not guilt exactly, but something in the same county. The particular expression of a man who had spent years being the most important person in a room and was beginning to understand that importance and culpability were not the same thing, but that the distance between them had just gotten significantly shorter. I didn't know, he said. She looked at him. About the transfers. About the records. He said it quietly enough that only she could hear it over the engine noise of a vehicle idling at the bay entrance. I knew our transfer rates were high. I knew Sykes pushed for fast discharges on certain patient categories. I thought it was a billing strategy. I didn't... He stopped. You didn't ask, Sara said. The words came out flat, not accusatory, which was almost worse than if they'd been angry. Brill looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I didn't ask." She held his gaze for 2 seconds. "Then you should ask now," she said. "Because there are patients in your system whose records don't match what actually happened to them, and some of them are not at other facilities. Some of them—" She stopped herself because she didn't have confirmation of what she was about to say, and she would not speculate beyond what she knew. "You should ask," she said again. She walked to the waiting SUV. The drive to Mercy West in Farmington took just under an hour, and Sara spent most of it looking out the window at the darkening landscape. The high desert transitioning to Mesa, the sky going from cold blue to the specific deep indigo of a Colorado November evening, and thinking about the structure of what she knew versus the structure of what could be proven, which were two different architectures and only one of them would matter in the next several weeks. She thought about Margaret Osei. She thought about Jerome Ashby. She thought about the 12 photographs on her phone and what they represented. Not a complete picture, but a thread, and a thread was enough to pull if you knew where to pull. Cal was in the front passenger seat. He hadn't spoken since they left the hospital, which she didn't mind. The driver was one of his team, a compact, quiet man who had been introduced to her only as Harlow, and who drove with the specific attention of someone who has done driving in situations where driving was itself a tactical act. They were 40 minutes out when Cal's phone rang. He answered, said 2 words, "Go ahead," and then listened without speaking for approximately 90 seconds. And Sara, watching the profile of his face reflected in the dark window, watched something go still in him that hadn't been still before. He ended the call. "What?" she said. He turned to look at her. Marcus stayed behind at Cresthaven to liaise with Park's office while she traveled with Voss. He paused. He paused. "He called to tell me that hospital security pulled the external camera footage from the ambulance bay. The footage from this afternoon. The footage of the vehicles arriving. And the footage of who went in and out of the building afterward." Another pause. "They know which vehicle you're in." Sara turned to look out the back window. The road behind them was dark, empty. 2 lanes of state highway cutting through scrubland, the kind of road that was easy to follow from a distance with lights off. "Did Marcus see a tail?" she said. "He saw a vehicle leave the hospital lot approximately 4 minutes after us." She looked at the dark highway behind them. "How far to Farmington?" she said. 38 minutes, Harlow said from the front. She did the math. "Can we lose 4 minutes and 38? She said. Cal was already on his phone again, calling Marcus, giving him the vehicle make and their current position in the clipped specific shorthand of someone working a tactical problem rather than having a conversation. Sara listened and looked at the road ahead and behind and thought about Lorraine Sykes standing by the window with nothing behind her eyes, and the resume call speed when she'd spotted Sara in the corridor, and the 11-minute gap between the bulk export and the preservation order. They had not panicked. They had acted with the calm, practiced efficiency of people who had managed problems like this before, which meant they had managed problems like this before, which meant the scale of what Sara had found in 41 notebook entries was the edge of something considerably larger. She had known that, intellectually, since Rhonda Park told her about the property. She was knowing it differently now. Harlow said, "I've got headlights." In the passenger side mirror, a quarter-mile back, 2 points of light had appeared. They were not closing fast. They were pacing. "Professional," Cal said quietly. Not alarmed. Observing. "They're not trying to catch us," Sara said. "They're tracking us. They want to know where we go." "Why?" She thought about it for 4 seconds. "Because they don't know what I gave Park. They know I was in that consultation room for 40 minutes. They don't know what evidence I handed over or what direction the investigation is going. If they can find out where I'm based, who I'm with, they'll know how much trouble they're in," Cal said. "Or how much time they have," Sara said. "If the answer is not much, they move faster. If they think they have leverage, they'll wait and try to take the legal route." Cal was on his phone again, not calling Marcus this time, someone else, and the call was brief and consisted primarily of their current coordinates and a highway reference point, and then he ended it and said to Harlow, "Mile marker 219, take the exit." Harlow said, "That adds 20 minutes. "I know." Sara looked at the headlights in the mirror. They maintained distance. "We're leading them away from Voss," she said. Cal didn't answer, which was an answer. She settled back against the seat and watched the dark desert move past the windows and thought, with the cold, clear precision of someone whose particular skill set had not actually gone away just because she'd been pretending it had, about the exact sequence of events that would need to happen in the next 48 hours if what Rhonda Park was building was going to hold together in front of a federal judge. She needed to think about something else, but this was the only thing her brain would currently run. The headlights stayed with them when they took the exit. "They're committed," Harlow said. "I know," Cal said. And then, to Sara, "Park's going to want your testimony formalized as soon as we're at Mercy West. Full deposition, recorded." "Okay. Tonight if possible." "Okay. You ready for that?" She thought about the 41 entries, the photographs, the specific and clear way she could narrate every observation, its date and context, and what she'd been doing when she'd made it. She thought about standing in front of a review board and a legal challenge and whatever Sykes and the hospital's lawyers would construct. And she thought about doing it as Sara Whitfield, nursing student, suspended, credentials questioned, whose only authority was that she'd been paying attention. "Yes," she said. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, different from the one Cal had used, and she would normally not answer an unknown number under these circumstances. But something made her look at the number for a long second before she did. She answered. The voice on the other end was not one she recognized. It was female, low, with the controlled quality of someone speaking from a location where being overheard was a concern. "Ms. Whitfield," the voice said, "my name is Della Osei. Margaret Osei was my mother." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. "I've been trying to find out what happened to her for 4 months," the voice said. "She was transferred from Cresthaven, and she died 6 days later, and nobody would tell us where she'd been or who had treated her." A breath. "I got your name from a nurse at Cresthaven. She said you'd been asking questions. She said you'd been suspended for it." A pause. "She said if anyone had found anything, it was you." In the passenger side mirror, the headlights were still there. Sara looked at the dark road ahead. "Miss Osei," she said carefully, "where are you right now?" A silence. Then, "I'm in the Cresthaven parking lot. I came to demand answers. But when I got here, there were federal vehicles, and everyone was acting strange, and a nurse told me to wait, and gave me your number." Her voice had the specific, fragile quality of someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has just been told the ground might be close. "Can you tell me what happened to my mother?" Cal had heard enough of it. The tinny projection of the voice through the phone, the words he'd caught. That he was already looking at Sara. His expression was careful, and asking a question he didn't put into words. Sara looked at the headlights in the mirror, then she looked at the dark highway ahead. "Miss Osei," she said, "don't stay in that parking lot. Get in your car, drive to a public place, somewhere well lit, somewhere busy, and call this number back in 20 minutes. "Why? What's happening?" "I'll explain when you call back." Sara paused. "Your mother's name in my files. What happened to her? I can't give you everything tonight, but I can tell you it wasn't an accident and it wasn't her fault. And I can tell you that the people responsible are running out of time." A silence on the line. Then Della Osei said quietly, "Okay." The call ended. Sara lowered the phone. In the mirror, the headlights were gone. Not slowed, not turning, gone. As if the vehicle had simply switched its lights off on a dark highway in the middle of the Colorado scrubland, which was worse than if it had kept following them, because it meant whoever was driving had decided that maintaining visual contact was less important than not being seen. They were still back there. She was sure of it. They just didn't want to be found anymore. "Harlow," Cal said. "Eyes." Harlow adjusted the mirrors without being told which ones. His speed didn't change. His hands didn't move on the wheel. He was the kind of driver who communicated entirely through the vehicle. Small pressure adjustments, lane positioning, the particular steadiness that meant he was tracking everything around them without letting any of it show in how the car moved. "I've got nothing confirmed," Harlow said. "Could have pulled off onto a ranch road. Could be running parallel on 172. Or they called it in and someone else picks us up closer to Farmington," Cal said. "Yes." Sara was already thinking the same thing. The switch-off was a standard surveillance technique when you didn't want the target to identify a consistent tail. You handed off to a second vehicle closer to the destination, and the first car vanished before the target thought to count how many miles it had been following them. It required coordination, which meant whoever was running this had resources beyond 2 people and a borrowed hospital security feed. She thought about Lorraine Sykes's phone call, the speed of it, the fact that it had resumed before Sara was through the exit door. They had this ready, she said. Cal turned enough to look at her. The contingency, she said, the bulk export, the legal motion, the vehicle. They had at least some of this prepared in advance. Not for me specifically. They had a protocol for if the investigation got too close, and my suspension was supposed to be the end of it, and when we arrived and it didn't end, they activated the next layer. Which means they've activated it before, Cal said. Or they built it knowing they'd need it eventually. Harlow said, lights, pickup truck. Quarter-mile back, off the shoulder. The highway was dark enough that it would have been easy to miss. A truck parked on the gravel shoulder with its running lights off, engine presumably on, waiting for them to pass so it could fall in behind. Amateur surveillance didn't do that. Amateur surveillance kept moving. Whatever was behind them had spent time and resources on this, and the fact that they were willing to expend those resources on a nursing student and a SEAL team escort said more about how much they had to lose than anything Sara had found in the records. Don't change speed, Cal said to Harlow. Then to Sara. Park. Call her. Sara called. Park answered on the second ring, which meant she was awake and either already at Mercy West or close. The vehicle that left Cresthaven after us, Sara said. It dropped surveillance. We think there's a handoff. Second vehicle, currently behind us. Are you at Mercy West? Pulling in now, Park said. Voss is stable. Transfer went clean. What's your ETA? 22 minutes if we don't take another detour. Sara looked at Cal. He shook his head once, which meant no more detours, which meant they were committing to the direct route and trusting Harlow to manage whatever came from behind them. 22 minutes, she told Park. I'll have the facility's security briefed. Come to the east entrance, not the main. Understood. And Sara. Park's voice shifted slightly, not softer but different. The tone of someone adding information they've been sitting with. My office ran the contractor name through our federal vendor database. The DoD contracts go back 9 years. Total billing over that period is somewhere north of $40 million. Sara looked at the dark highway. 9 years, she said. The Cresthaven relationship started 6 years ago. Before that, the contractor was using 2 other regional hospitals. Both have since closed. Both had anomalous transfer patterns in the years before closure that were attributed to facility mismanagement. They weren't mismanaged, Sara said. They were used and then abandoned when the exposure risk got too high. That's the working theory, Park said, which makes Cresthaven the current active site and makes the timing of your investigation inconvenient for the cycle, Sara said. They weren't planning to stay much longer anyway. They were going to close it out, move on, and Cresthaven would eventually close or restructure, and whatever was in the records would get buried in the institutional transition. If you hadn't started pulling files, Park said. And if Voss hadn't been routed here, Sara said, which was the variable nobody had planned for, the thing that turned a manageable documentation problem into a federal investigation in a single afternoon. She looked at the pickup truck's lights, visible now in Harlow's side mirror, a steady pair of points maintaining distance. We'll see you in 20, she said, and ended the call. They arrived at Mercy West's east entrance at 7:41 p.m. with the pickup truck still a quarter-mile behind them and a second vehicle. Cal had spotted it, black sedan, no plates visible, that had joined from an on-ramp 4 miles back. Harlow pulled into the ambulance bay without stopping at the security checkpoint because Cal had called ahead and the gate was already rising, and the 2 pursuing vehicles rolled past the entrance on the main road without turning in, which meant they'd logged their destination and were now either repositioning or reporting. Rhonda Park was waiting inside with a Mercy West security liaison and a man Sara didn't recognize who was wearing a federal marshal's jacket over civilian clothes. The jacket was new information. Park had escalated while they were on the road. The marshal is here because of the witness transportation angle, Park said, reading Sara's face. Standard protocol when a material witness is in transit. Am I a material witness, or am I a person you're trying to keep track of? Sara said. Park considered that for a moment. Both, she said, which Sara appreciated for its honesty. The east wing of Mercy West was quieter than the main building. Lower lighting, fewer staff visible, the specific hushed quality of a hospital section that handled sensitive or security-adjacent cases. Voss was 2 floors up, and Cal went directly there while Park led Sara to a conference room that had been set up with recording equipment and 2 chairs across a table. "Tonight?" Sara said. "I'd rather have your formal statement before morning," Park said, "in case anything changes overnight." "You mean in case their lawyers file an emergency motion to suppress? In case anything changes overnight," Park said again, in the same tone, and Sara sat down. The deposition took 3 hours and 17 minutes. Sara told it the way she'd experienced it, chronologically, specifically, without editorial. She described each chart she'd pulled, each discrepancy she'd found, the method she'd used to cross-reference against the patient registry, the dates of each photograph and what she'd been doing when she took it. She described the notebook, the entries, her notation system. She described what she'd observed of Lorraine Sykes's behavior during the suspension meeting and in the corridor afterward without characterizing it as guilt or knowledge, just behavior, observable, documented. When she got to Margaret Osei, she told it carefully. Initials in the notebook, transfer without completed surgical workup, paperwork anomalies. She did not tell it the way she'd felt it, the cold weight of a real person reduced to a series of administrative decisions, because that wasn't what Park needed. She told it like a record. By the time they finished, it was 11 at night and Sara's throat was dry, and she'd consumed 2 cups of bad hospital coffee and 1 cup of water, and her back hurt in the specific way of someone who'd been sitting in an institutional chair in a state of sustained tension for the better part of 4 hours. Park handed her a 3rd cup of water. "You're good at this," she said. "At what?" "Testimony. Most people drift, start editorializing, or leave gaps because they assume I'll fill them, or they get emotional at the parts that are emotional and lose the thread." She looked at Sara over the recording equipment. "You stayed in the material." "I know what happens when witnesses drift," Sara said. Park looked at her with the recalculating expression again, and this time Sara thought she saw it complete, watched Park arrive at a conclusion about who Sara Whitfield actually was, and then Park let it go, which was the professional choice and also, Sara thought, the considerate one. "Della Osei," Sara said. "She called me from the Crest Haven parking lot. I told her to go somewhere public and call back." "I know. She called my office. We have someone with her." Park set down her own cup. "She has information we didn't have. Her mother wasn't transferred to the facility outside Durango. She was transferred to a second location, a different property, 40 miles east. That property is registered to the same shell company structure, different subsidiary." Sara went still. "A second site," she said. "Possibly a third," Park said. "We're tracing the subsidiary tree. It's layered. It took my office's financial crimes unit most of the afternoon just to get to the second layer." A pause. "What you found, Sara? The 41 entries in that notebook. That's the visible portion. The mechanism goes deeper." "How many patients?" Sara said. "We don't have a number yet." "Estimate." Park was quiet for a moment. "Across Crest Haven and the 2 prior facilities across 9 years? Hundreds, possibly more." She said it without softening it, which Sara had asked for by pushing for a number. "Some of those patients recovered and were discharged from the secondary facilities without understanding what had happened to them. Some didn't recover." Sara put her hands flat on the table. "Margaret Osei didn't recover," she said. "No." She breathed. She kept her hands flat. She thought about 41 entries and 9 years and hundreds of patients, and the word hundreds did something to her chest that she was going to have to process later, when there was room for it. "What do you need from me now?" she said. What Park needed was for Sara to review a set of documents her office had pulled from the DoD contractor database, procurement records, billing invoices, service logs, and flag anything that corresponded to patient transfers or treatment events she recognized from the Crest Haven records. It was meticulous work, the kind of careful alignment between 2 bodies of documentation that built a legal case from the bottom up rather than from the top, and they worked at it until 2 in the morning with a junior investigator from Park's office assisting, a young woman named Priya who had the precise, quiet energy of someone who loved this kind of work and was very good at it. They found 16 direct matches, specific billing invoices for emergency medical transport services rendered to patients on the dates corresponding to transfers Sara had flagged, billed to DoD accounts at rates between 3 and 7 times the actual documented service cost, supported by treatment records, that described procedures that either hadn't been performed or had been performed at a fraction of the documented complexity. "That's fraud," Priya said at one point, not to anyone in particular, just releasing the word into the room because it needed to be said. "That's a portion of it," Park said. 16 matches and Sarah's 41 entries. We need to cross-reference against the full 6-year record. "That's weeks of work," Priya said. "The 16 are enough for the arrest warrants," Park said. "The rest builds the case for trial." Sarah looked up. "Arrest warrants." Park met her eyes. "I filed the applications 90 minutes ago." Sarah took that in. "Sykes," she said. "Lorraine Sykes. Alan Holt. He may have known less than Sykes, but he knew enough and he didn't report it. And the contractor's principal, a man named Garrett Finch, who incorporated the first shell company 9 years ago and has been managing the billing side since before Cresthaven was involved." A pause. "There are 2 board members as well. The warrants are sealed until morning, when we execute." "In the morning. 6 a.m., coordinated. We don't want anyone making calls." Sarah thought about Lorraine Sykes resuming her phone call before Sarah was through the hospital exit door, about the bulk export 11 minutes before the preservation order, about the truck parked on the highway shoulder with its lights off. "She's going to know something is coming," Sarah said. "She doesn't know how much we have. She knows I gave you something. She knows about the photographs. She doesn't know specifically what I photographed, but she knows I had evidence that predates the export." Sarah looked at the billing invoices spread across the table. "She's been running this for 6 years. She's not going to sit in her house and wait." Park's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Whatever she read, it changed her face. Not dramatically, but enough. The careful composure shifted a fraction, tightened in a way that said the news was not catastrophic, but was not good. "What?" Sarah said. "Holt," Park said. "He tried to leave Durango tonight. His car was flagged at a highway checkpoint 20 minutes ago." She was typing as she spoke. "He had 2 external hard drives in the vehicle. Personal items," he told the officer. "We had a travel advisory on him as a precaution." She looked up. "He's being detained." "He was running," Sarah said. "Someone tipped him," Park said. "Or he made the calculation himself. Either way, if he was running tonight, Sykes knows the timeline." She put the phone down. "I need to move the arrest to 4 a.m. The room compressed slightly, the way it did when a plan had to accelerate and everyone in it had to recalibrate simultaneously. Priya started organizing the documents. Sarah started doing the thing she'd learned to do when timelines compressed, clearing unnecessary thought, isolating the immediate requirements from the things that would matter later. "What do you need me to do between now and 4 a.m.?" she said. "Oh." Cal found her at 2:45 in a small family waiting room off the East Corridor, sitting in a chair that was specifically designed to be uncomfortable in the way that institutional furniture sometimes is, as if the architects had decided that too much comfort might invite people to stay. She'd been awake for over 20 hours, and her body knew it in the way bodies communicated these things. Not dramatically, just insistently, a background pressure that she was managing by ignoring. He sat down across from her. "Voss is asking about you," he said. "Is he sleeping?" "He was. He woke up about an hour ago. Torres came with the transfer. She's up there." He paused. "She's good." "I know." He stretched his legs, crossed his arms, looked at the ceiling. He had the same quality she'd noticed in the ambulance bay. A capacity for stillness that wasn't passive, that was doing something even when the body wasn't moving. "Park moved the arrests up," he said. "Yes." "You think Sykes runs?" Sarah thought about it honestly. "No, I think she fights. She's been managing problems for 6 years, and the system she built has a lot of layers. She still thinks she can argue her way out of this." "Can she?" "No." She said it without hesitation, which surprised her slightly, because certainty of that kind was usually something she came to more carefully. "We have the billing records matching my transfers. We have the photographs that predate the export. We have Voss's injury location connecting the contractor to the operational damage. That's not just fraud. That's a federal employee harmed in a location connected to the fraud. And we have Della Ose, whose mother died." She paused. "Lawyers can fight evidence. You can argue timestamps and access credentials and chain of custody. But you can't argue a dead woman's daughter out of a witness stand." Cal was quiet for a moment. Harlow told me something, he said. She looked at him. When you were in the deposition, he had time to run background on the Cresthaven situation. He's good with that kind of research, which is its own story. Cal uncrossed his arms. The two facilities before Cresthaven, the ones that closed. Park mentioned them. One of them closed because its chief administrator died, Cal said. Sudden cardiac event. 53 years old. No prior cardiac history documented. He looked at her steadily. That administrator had filed a complaint with the state medical board 2 weeks before she died. Complaint alleged systematic record falsification. Sara held very still. It was ruled natural causes, Cal said. Of course it was. I'm not saying, but you're telling me so I'm aware of the pattern, Sara said. I'm aware of it. He held her gaze. Park knows, Sara said. Harlow sent it to her 40 minutes ago. Okay, she breathed. Okay. Then it's in the record, and it's something the investigation will address. That's the professional response, Cal said. That's the accurate response, Sara said. The other response is that I've been in this hospital for 2 hours thinking I was the most exposed person in this situation. And it turns out the exposure profile is different than I calculated, and She stopped. Recalibrating, Cal offered. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Voss wants to say something to you. I told him I'd ask if you had 10 minutes. She stood up, which answered the question. Daniel Voss looked better than he had a right to, given the day he'd had. The color had come back into his face, the alarming gray pallor replaced by something closer to normal, and he was propped slightly upright with the careful posture of someone who'd been told in specific terms not to put lateral pressure on the left side of his chest, and was taking that instruction seriously because he knew exactly what was on the other side of the chest tube. Torres was charting at the room's small desk. She glanced at Sara when she came in, and something in her expression shifted. Not deference, not the anxiety of a resident in the presence of someone more experienced, but something more like acknowledgement, one competent person to another, which Sara registered and appreciated. Give us a minute, Voss said to Torres. Torres capped her pen. I'll be right outside. She looked at Sara again as she passed. You took a clean decompression angle. I've seen attendings miss that approach. She said it without weight, just as a fact, and walked out. Sara sat in the chair beside Voss's bed. He looked at her for a moment. He had the eyes of someone who'd spent time in situations where reading people quickly was a survival skill, and he was doing it now, not invasively, just the background assessment of someone for whom it was automatic. Cal told me what you did, he said. In the bay. Cal's team got you here, Sara said. Torres placed the tube. You called it from the parking lot. A pause. I heard from Merritt that you told the residents not to let anyone alter the documentation afterward. Standard practice. He didn't call her on it directly, just let the understatement sit. I know who you are, he said. Not from what happened today. From before. She looked at the window. Kandahar, he said. Not me. I wasn't there. But I know people who were. 3 guys who shouldn't have made it back and did, and they described the medic who ran that extraction the same way every time. Air Force. Wouldn't stop moving. Kept all 4 of them functional in a blown vehicle for 6 hours with what was essentially a trauma kit and a tire iron. He paused. They described what she looked like. People remember things in crisis that aren't always accurate, Sara said. Maybe. He looked at the ceiling. I'm not here to push you on something you don't want pushed. He stopped, which was unusual, she suspected, for him. I wanted to say thank you for today and for whatever you did before today. Both matter. Sara looked at him. He was not performing gratitude. He was simply in possession of it and offering it without expecting anything in return, which was rarer than it should have been. Get some sleep, she said. Your pressure needs to come up another 10 points and rest will help more than anything else I can give you. He almost smiled. Clinical answer. It's the right answer. She stood up. She was almost to the door when he said, Sara. She turned. Whatever's happening tonight, he said. Whatever Park is doing, you started it. That matters. She held his gaze for 1 second. Then she walked out. At 3:58 in the morning, Rhonda Park's phone rang. Sara was in the corridor outside, in the same uncomfortable chair she'd found earlier, when she heard it through the thin wall of the conference room. Not the content, just the changed acoustic quality, That meant Park had answered and the call was significant. Cal was at the east entrance with two of his team, running a check on the perimeter. The pickup truck and the sedan hadn't reappeared, which was not reassuring, just quiet. Harlow was somewhere she didn't know. Marcus Webb was still at Cresthaven. Park came into the corridor at 4:03. Her face said something had happened. "Sykes," Sara said. "She's gone," Park said. The officers arrived at her residence at 3:55. She wasn't there. Vehicle was gone. Security camera at the end of her block shows her leaving at 2:48 a.m. 2:48. 40 minutes after Holt had been detained at the checkpoint. Someone had told her, or she'd been monitoring the checkpoint, or she had a contingency that triggered on Holt's detention. Sara did the math. It was now 4:03. Sykes had a 75-minute head start. "Airport," Sara said. "We have holds at Durango La Plata and at Albuquerque. She can't fly commercial." A pause. "Private strips are the problem. There are 11 within a 100-mile radius that handle single-engine and light twin. We've contacted 6. 5 outstanding," Sara said. "Yes." Cal had appeared at the end of the corridor. He'd heard enough from his position. "Does Garrett Finch have access to private aviation?" Sara said. Park's expression confirmed it before she spoke. "He owns a share in a Cessna Citation registered to one of the subsidiary LLCs. We've had a hold filed on it for 2 hours. But if there's another aircraft..." Sara's phone buzzed. She looked at it. Della Ose. She answered. "I'm sorry it's so late," Della said. She didn't sound like she'd been sleeping. "The investigator who was with me, she left about an hour ago. I've been sitting here and I remembered something I didn't think to mention earlier." "Tell me," Sara said. "My mother's paperwork, from the transfer. I found it in her apartment after she died. There was a signature on the authorization form, not the doctor's signature, a secondary authorization. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. I still have the paperwork." "What name was on it?" Sara said. "Finch," Della said. "G. Finch." Sara looked at Park. Park pulled out her phone and was already dialing. "Where are you right now?" Sara said to Della. "I'm at the hotel the investigator arranged for me, in Farmington." "Stay there," Sara said. "Don't open the door for anyone you don't know. I'll call you back within the hour." She ended the call. Park was speaking rapidly into her phone, the name Finch and the words private aviation and secondary authorization running together. Cal was beside Sara, close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. "Finch's name is on a patient transfer authorization," she said. "Not hospital staff, not a physician, a contractor's principal, signing off on a patient transfer." Cal said, "That's not a documentation fraud." "No," Sara said. "That's direct involvement in the patient disposition. That's criminal conspiracy at minimum, and if the patient died..." "It's worse," Cal said, significantly. Park lowered her phone. Her face had the quality of someone who is running very fast in a very controlled direction. "Finch's Cessna," she said. "The hold we filed. It was filed with the FAA. But one of my office's agents just ran the physical location check on the aircraft registration address." She looked at Sara. "The hangar is at a private strip 12 miles outside Durango. The strip does not appear on any of the 11 we identified because it's registered as an agricultural airfield." "An agricultural designation," Sara said. "It wouldn't show up in a standard airport search." "No." "Is the plane still there?" Cal said. Park's phone rang again before she could answer. She picked up, listened for 8 seconds. Her jaw tightened. "We have a visual confirmation on the aircraft," she said when she lowered the phone. "It's on the runway, engine running, 2 individuals visible. One identified as Finch from security footage at the hangar entrance." "And the second?" Sara said. Park looked at her. "Female," she said. "Dark blazer." Sara Whitfield, who had spent 4 months making herself invisible, who had 41 entries in a green notebook and 12 photographs on her phone, and 3 years of another life she'd been trying not to live, stood in the corridor of Mercy West Regional Medical Center at 4:07 in the morning and felt something in her chest go completely, absolutely still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of a person who has just seen every piece of a problem she's been solving for 3 months align into a single point. "They're leaving together," she said. "The plane is moving," Park said, already walking. "We have 12 minutes. Park was already moving, and Sara was 2 steps behind her, and Cal was beside her without needing to be asked. which was the thing about people who'd spent years in situations where hesitation was its own kind of decision. They moved first and organized the details in transit. The East Corridor was empty at this hour, their footsteps loud on the linoleum, and Park was on her phone while she walked, giving coordinates and an aircraft description, and the words runway active in the clipped cadence of someone who had rehearsed exactly this kind of call, even while hoping she'd never need to make it. The federal marshal who'd been stationed near the entrance fell in without being told, his hand moving to his radio in the practiced reflex of someone whose job was to respond to exactly this quality of urgency. Sarah's mind was running the clock. 12 minutes was Park's estimate, and that estimate was based on a visual confirmation that had come through approximately 40 seconds ago. And in the time since then, the plane had continued moving. A Cessna Citation on a private agricultural strip. She didn't know the specific variant, which determined its runway requirements, but even a light Citation needed a minimum of 3,000 feet of runway to rotate, and a 12-mile drive to the strip at 4 in the morning on Colorado rural roads was not 12 minutes. It was closer to 18, and the difference between 12 and 18 was the difference between an aircraft on the runway and an aircraft at altitude. And at altitude, it became an FAA problem and a radar problem, and a much longer and more complicated legal problem. She said this to Cal as they pushed through the east entrance doors into the cold black of the parking lot. He was already on his phone. "I know. I'm working on it." "What are you working on?" "Something faster than a car." She didn't ask the follow-up because there wasn't time, and because Cal Merritt had spent his career solving exactly the category of problem that presented as impossible given available resources. And she'd seen enough in the past several hours to know that his working on it was worth more than her understanding what it meant. The federal marshal had a vehicle, a black SUV that was already running, another marshal in the driver's seat, the engine warm, which meant someone had anticipated this possibility and staged accordingly. Park climbed in. Sarah climbed in. The marshal from the entrance took the rear. Cal had stopped walking and was standing 15 feet from the vehicle with his phone to his ear and his back slightly turned, which meant the call was something he didn't want everyone to hear. "Go," Sarah said to Park. "Merritt. He'll have his own way there. Go." Park looked at her for 1 second, then, "Drive," she told the marshal. Well, 12 miles on rural Colorado roads at 4 in the morning was its own particular experience. Darkness that was total beyond the headlight throw, the occasional flash of a fence post or a cattle gate, the road surface alternating between decent asphalt and the washboard quality of county maintenance that prioritized harvest season agricultural traffic and nothing else. The driver pushed as hard as the road allowed, which was faster than comfortable and slower than necessary. And in the back seat, Sarah tracked the time on her phone and did the math she'd already done, and arrived at the same answer she'd already arrived at. She thought about Lorraine Sykes in a dark blazer on a runway 12 miles away. She thought about the specific quality of Sykes's composure, that boardroom stillness that practiced nothing behind the eyes, and tried to place it against the image of the same woman in a car at 2:48 in the morning, in the dark, making the decision to run. It was harder to composite those two images than she expected. The stillness and the flight felt like different people, and she knew they weren't, and she knew that was the thing about people who built systems of control over years. The system eventually became the only ground they knew how to stand on. And when the ground moved, what you got was not composed authority, but raw velocity, the animal decision to move before the walls came in. Sykes had been building this for at least 6 years, maybe longer. She'd constructed an institution around her ability to manage information, to predict who would ask questions, and neutralize them before the questions became problems, to keep the machinery running quietly enough that nobody who mattered ever had a reason to look. She had not predicted Sara Whitfield. That was the part of it Sara kept returning to, not with pride, but with the specific recognition that the miscalculation had been rational. Sykes had seen a nursing student, and nursing students were managed the way she'd managed every other institutional threat, and the management had worked right up until the moment it hadn't. 4 minutes into the drive, Sarah's phone rang. "Cal," she answered. "There's a sheriff's deputy 12 miles from the strip," he said, "already en route. And I've got a state police helicopter that was doing an overnight patrol over the national forest. They're redirecting." "How close?" "Helicopter is 7 minutes out from the strip. Deputy is 4. She did the math. "The plane may already be rolling for takeoff," she said. The helicopter has instructions to illuminate the runway if it gets there first. Make it impossible to maintain taxi speed safely. A pause. It's not a guaranteed stop, but it's something. It's something, she agreed. Park had been listening from the front seat. The FAA has issued an emergency ground stop for the airfield designation. If the pilot is monitoring any standard frequency, private strip, Sara said. Finch controls the airfield registration. He may not be monitoring. May not, Park said, which was the honest version of probably isn't. They were 8 miles out. Sara looked at the darkness outside the window and thought about Margaret Osei's daughter sitting in a hotel room in Farmington, awake, waiting for a call back that Sara had promised her within the hour. She thought about Jerome Ashby and his backdated medication order. She thought about the Cresthaven nurses who had been afraid for years and had watched colleagues lose their jobs for asking the wrong questions, and had learned to be afraid so well that fear had become indistinguishable from the normal texture of the work. She thought about the administrator at the prior facility who had filed a complaint with the state medical board and died 2 weeks later. 7 miles. The road improved slightly, new asphalt, and the driver pushed the speed up. Then the radio from the marshal in the front crackled, and a voice that was not calm but was managing itself said, "Visual confirmation on the aircraft. It's moving. Runway heading." Park said, "Where's the helicopter?" Radio, estimated 90 seconds. And the deputy? On the access road, 2 minutes. 6 miles of dark Colorado highway between them and the strip. Sara looked at the time. She looked at the math. She looked at the darkness. "It's going to be close," the driver said. "Drive," Park said. The helicopter arrived first. Sara couldn't see it from the vehicle. They were still 4 miles out. But the radio told it in fragments. The sound of rotors. The deputy's voice saying, "I've got visual on the bird." The helicopter pilot's clipped transmission about runway illumination, searchlight active, and then a pause that lasted long enough to be significant, and then the deputy again. "Aircraft has stopped." Park exhaled. Sara didn't say anything. She looked at her hands. The Cessna Citation had been 50 meters from rotation speed when the helicopter searchlight hit the runway ahead of it, turning the dark agricultural strip into a lit corridor that made continuing forward a proposition of flying blind into whatever was beyond the light's edge, which the pilot, whoever Finch had employed for this, had apparently decided was not worth the risk. The aircraft had braked, had come to a stop approximately 2/3 down the runway length. They arrived 4 minutes later to a scene that was organized chaos of the kind Sara recognized from another context. Multiple vehicles at awkward angles, radios overlapping, the cold night air carrying voices across the flat agricultural land in that particular way that made everything sound closer than it was. The helicopter was orbiting overhead at low altitude, its searchlight fixed on the aircraft, which sat on the runway with its engine now cut and its navigation lights on and its cabin door not yet open. The deputy had positioned his vehicle across the runway access road. 2 state police units had arrived in the time between the stop and Sara's vehicle reaching the strip, which meant the call had cascaded faster than she'd expected, which meant somebody in Park's office had been working the phone tree aggressively. Park got out of the vehicle and moved toward the runway with the marshal. Sara got out and stood beside the SUV and watched. The cabin door opened. Garrett Finch came out first. He was a man of about 60, with the compact, maintained appearance of someone who'd spent money on looking like money. And even in the searchlight at 4 in the morning, he had the instinctive posture of a person who believed that presence was a form of argument. He held his hands at his sides, not raised, which was either a legal calculation or a personality one. And he looked at the law enforcement vehicles around him with the expression of someone reviewing a situation they intend to negotiate. He did not look like a man who believed he was finished. Lorraine Sykes came out second. She looked different than Sara had seen her look before. Not the composed administrator, not the window-staring nothing behind the eyes version. She stood at the top of the aircraft steps and looked at the searchlight and the vehicles and the uniforms, and what Sara could see in her face from 50 feet away was not panic and not performance. It was the specific expression of a person watching the architecture of their life disassemble in real time, and understanding for the first time that the architecture was the only thing that had been holding them upright. The marshals moved toward the aircraft. Sara watched. The arrests were not dramatic. That was the thing she kept coming back to later when she tried to describe it to people who asked. There was no confrontation, no moment of defiance, no speech. Finch asked for his attorney before the marshal had finished the formal language, which was his right, stated in the flat, experienced tone of someone who had rehearsed exactly this scenario. Sykes said nothing at all. She came down the aircraft steps with the careful movement of someone managing their balance on unfamiliar terrain, and she was placed in restraints without resistance, and she was walked to a vehicle, and that was it. Cal arrived 11 minutes after Sara in one of the team's SUVs, and he came to stand beside her at the edge of the access road, and they watched the process from that distance without speaking. After a while, he said, "How are you doing?" She thought about answering accurately, which would have taken more words than the moment called for, and instead said, "I'm tired." "You should be." "What about Holt?" "In federal custody in Durango. His lawyers are already there." A pause. "He's going to cooperate. That's the read from Park's office. He was a follower in this, not an architect. He'll give them what they need on the billing structure." "And the board members?" "Warrants executed at 4:15, both in custody." He looked at the Cessna, sitting on the runway with its lights still on, looking almost peaceful in the helicopter's wash. "It's done," he said. She looked at the aircraft. "The patients from the other facilities," she said, "the ones whose records were managed the same way." Park said hundreds. "The investigation is going to take months, probably longer. But they'll find them." "Yes." He said it with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that yes didn't make the months shorter or the findings easier. They'll find them. She thought about Della Osei's mother, the paperwork with Finch's signature on the secondary authorization. A woman transferred before her surgical workup was complete, moved to a secondary facility, dead 6 days later, her daughter spending 4 months trying to understand why nobody would explain what had happened. The answer was not complicated, in the end. The answer was that her life had been worth less than the billing efficiency of moving her out of Cresthaven's system before the complex case consumed more resources than it generated, and that calculation had been made by people in blazers and administrative titles who had been making it so long that it no longer registered as a calculation about a human being. Sara was not going to be okay with that. She was clear about that. She was going to be functional and professional and do what was needed in the weeks ahead. But she was not going to process what had happened at these facilities into something she was okay with, because being okay with it would require a kind of distance she didn't have and didn't want. She said, "I need to call Della Osei." "It's 4:30 in the morning," Cal said. "I told her within the hour." Sara took out her phone. "She's been awake since this started. She deserves to hear it from me." He didn't argue. She stepped away from the vehicles, out toward the edge of the airfield where the searchlight didn't reach, and the sky above was the dense, absolute dark of rural Colorado at altitude in November, and she called. Della picked up immediately. "It's Sara," she said. "The people responsible for what happened to your mother are in custody tonight. I wanted you to know that before morning." A silence. Not absence. The specific weighted silence of someone receiving information. They've been carrying the anticipation of for a long time. Then Della said, very quietly, "Did they—" and stopped. "Your mother's name is in the federal evidence record," Sara said. "What happened to her will be part of the case. The investigation will document what they did and who made the decisions. That won't bring her back. I know that. But it won't be buried." The silence went on for another moment. "The woman who called you from the hospital," Della said. "The nurse who gave you my number." "Yes." "She said you'd been asking about my mother for weeks. Before any of this happened. Before you had any reason to keep going." A breath. "Why did you?" Sara looked at the dark sky. She thought about the honest answer, which was not a clean thing and not a flattering one, that she'd started noticing because she couldn't stop noticing, that the compulsion to pay attention when something was wrong was not a virtue she'd cultivated but a mechanism she'd been built by circumstance into, and that the momentum of noticing had carried her past the point where stopping would have been the rational choice, that she'd kept going partly because stopping felt like a betrayal of something she hadn't yet named. "Because her name was in the record," Sara said, "and it shouldn't have been." Della didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had the specific quality of someone who has been holding their weight on one leg for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. "Thank you," she said. Sara stayed outside for another few minutes after the call ended, in the cold and the dark, and let herself feel the weight of the past 24 hours without trying to organize it into anything useful. It was heavy, and it was complicated, and several parts of it were going to require attention at some point that she couldn't give them tonight. That was fine. She had learned a long time ago that the difference between people who came apart under sustained operational stress and people who didn't was not the absence of feeling. It was the capacity to defer it precisely, to know exactly where to set something down so you could find it again later. She was going to find all of it again later. She knew that. For right now, she turned and walked back toward the lights. The weeks that followed were the institutional kind of difficult, the kind that didn't announce itself dramatically, but wore at the edges of everything through sheer repetition. Depositions, formal statements, document reviews, interviews with federal prosecutors who needed her to explain the same entries in the notebook from several different angles to ensure consistency, which she understood was process and which she found exhausting in the specific way that revisiting the same material repeatedly without being able to move past it was exhausting. Rhonda Park ran the investigation with the methodical persistence of someone who understood that the cases most worth building were the ones that took the longest. By mid-December, the federal indictment covered Lorraine Sykes on 7 counts, including healthcare fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit federal contractor fraud. Garrett Finch faced 11 counts, including 2 related to the death of a patient at one of the prior facilities, a charge that required evidence Sara hadn't found, but that Finch's own billing records, subpoenaed from the shell company's servers, had made unavoidable. Alan Holt, as Cal had predicted, cooperated fully. His cooperation reduced his exposure significantly and increased the prosecution's case substantially, which was the transaction it was always going to be. The 2 Cresthaven board members entered plea agreements in January. Holt's plea was finalized in February, and the terms included a provision that required him to provide written testimony about every instance of documentation falsification he'd been aware of, which was a document that ran to 63 pages and identified 47 patients by name whose records had been altered during his tenure. Sara read the document when Park sent it to her as part of her status updates as a material witness. She read it once, in her apartment on a Tuesday evening, and then she put her phone down and sat for a while. And then she made dinner because she needed to do something with her hands. And then she called Park and asked what the timeline looked like for the 47 patients' families to be notified. "We're targeting March for the first wave of notifications," Park said. "Families are entitled to a case summary and a victim advocate contact. The process is long," Sara said. "Yes." A pause. "You should know. The patient notification process identified several individuals whose families had already tried to file complaints and been turned away. 2 of them had retained attorneys who hit dead ends because the records they were shown had been altered. Those attorneys are being contacted." Another pause. "They're going to have much better records to work with now." Sara looked at the wall of her apartment. "Good," she said. "What?" She reapplied to complete her nursing program in late January through a different clinical placement, a level 2 trauma center in Colorado Springs that Park's office had quietly contacted to explain the circumstances of Sara's suspension, ensuring that the Cresthaven documentation issues would not follow her application as a legitimate mark against her. She wasn't aware Park had done this until after the placement was approved, and when she found out, she called Park and said, "You didn't have to do that." Park said, "I know. Do you want me to undo it?" Sara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Okay then." She started the new placement in February. The trauma center was larger than Cresthaven, louder, more chaotic in the productive way of institutions that had more patients than capacity and had figured out how to function in the gap through the accumulated competence of people who'd been doing it long enough to make it look manageable. The attending physicians were not uniformly kind. She hadn't expected them to be, had in fact been slightly braced for the familiar architecture of institutional dismissal, but they were, most of them, operating in good faith, which was different from Cresthaven in a way she hadn't fully understood until she was inside a place where it was true. She still made herself small some days, still half-stepped back when someone walked too close in a narrow corridor, still calculated before speaking. She was working on it. She didn't have a clean relationship with it yet, and she suspected she wouldn't for a while. What she found in the Colorado Springs Trauma Center was that the things she'd spent years trying to keep separate from each other, the person she'd been before and the person she was trying to become, were not actually separable. The instincts were the instincts. The training was the training. She'd thought, when she left the Air Force, that she was leaving a version of herself that had gotten too close to something she couldn't survive staying close to, and she'd been right about that. But she'd made the error of thinking that leaving the context meant leaving the capacity, when what she'd actually done was carry the capacity into a new context and then try to pretend it wasn't there. It was there. It was always there. And on the Tuesday afternoon in her second week at the Colorado Springs placement, when a 26-year-old man came in with a penetrating chest injury and 3 of the 4 residents on shift froze for a crucial second that she didn't freeze for, she understood, not for the first time, but for the first time without the ambient shame of it, that the capacity was not the trauma. They were related, but they were not the same thing, and she could keep one without being destroyed by the other. She talked to a counselor on Thursday afternoons, had been since December. The counselor's name was Dr. Anita Reyes, and she was precise and direct and did not use the silence technique or any other manipulation, which Sara appreciated. Progress was slow and nonlinear, and Dr. Reyes had told her at the outset that it would be, and that turned out to be the most useful thing anyone had said to her in years, because she'd been braced for the opposite promise. Daniel Voss was discharged from Mercy West in early December, 11 days after the events at the airstrip. He'd had the thoracic repair he needed, done by a surgical team at Mercy West, and his recovery had followed the kind of arc that surgeons described as uncomplicated without meaning. It was easy. Torres had managed his post-procedure care with the same competent steadiness she'd shown in the Cresthaven trauma bay, and the 2 of them had apparently developed the specific, unromantic mutual respect of a patient and a clinician who'd been through a difficult thing together and come out the other side functional. He called Sara in January. She was in her apartment, eating the same breakfast she always ate, when her phone rang with his number, which she'd saved after he left Mercy West. "Torres told me she's applying for a fellowship at Denver General," he said, by way of opening, which was not what she'd expected. "Good for her," Sara said, and meant it. "She said you told her she placed the chest tube well." "She did." "She said you told her while the procedure was still happening, that you talked her through it without taking over." A pause. "She said that's rare. It's what the situation required." The pause that followed had the quality of someone getting to the thing they'd called to say. "The operational review of my unit's training exercise is complete. The injury location, the property, the contractor connection. It's part of the criminal case now. My unit's leadership submitted formal statements." A beat. "Cal told me about the administrator at the prior facility, the one who filed the complaint." "Yes." "That was going to happen again," Voss said. "Someone was going to get too close, and the people running this were going to make the same calculation. Maybe it would have been Park's office that found it eventually. Maybe not." He was quiet for a moment. "But you found it first, and you held on to it when they tried to take it from you. And the difference between first and eventually, in this case, is the people who were in that system during the gap." She didn't answer immediately. "I'm not saying it to make you feel good," he said. "I'm saying it because it's the accurate version of what happened." "I know," she said. "Thank you." She heard him shift position slightly, which still cost him something. "The unit is putting together a formal commendation for Kandahar and for November. I know that's not—" He paused. "I know you didn't keep this quiet because you wanted recognition. I know that's not what this was about." "No. But it's happening anyway. Because the people who were there deserve to know that what they experienced is documented somewhere, that someone put the right name to it." She looked out her kitchen window. The Colorado sky was flat and gray, early February, the mountains visible but muted. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "What?" The formal proceedings for the Sykes and Finch cases began in March, and Sara testified in the preliminary phase over 2 days, which was the more contained version of what the trial itself would require. She sat in a federal courtroom in Denver and told the record what she had observed, in chronological order, specifically, without editorial. And the defense attorneys asked her questions designed to establish that her access had been unauthorized, and that her observations were therefore those of an intruder rather than a witness. And she answered those questions with the same steadiness she'd brought to every other part of it, because the facts of what she'd seen did not become different facts based on the framing of who had seen them. Lorraine Sykes sat at the defense table and did not look at Sara during her testimony. Sara looked at Sykes, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a person watching justice that had felt like a long time coming. She looked at her the way you look at something you've spent months studying and have finally seen clearly, not as a verdict, not as a symbol, but as a person who had made a series of choices and had arrived at their consequence. That was the thing about sitting in a federal courtroom watching someone face the accounting for what they'd done. It was not, in the end, the triumphant thing Sara had sometimes imagined when the work had been hardest. It was smaller than that and more real than that. It was a room and a record and a process that was going to take months. And at the end of the process, people who had been hurt would have their names and documentation that said what had happened to them was not their fault and was not an accident and was not unwitnessed. It was not enough. She was honest about that with herself. It was not enough for Della Osei, whose mother was still dead. It was not enough for the patients whose records had been altered at 2 prior facilities, whose families were being contacted now with information that would reopen griefs they'd been trying to close. But it was something and something she had learned. Not recently, long before this, in dusty forward operating locations and blown vehicles and 6-hour waits for backup that sometimes arrived and sometimes didn't. Something was the only available unit of measure. You did what you could with what you had in the time you were given, and then you documented it clearly so it could be found, and then you kept going. She had kept going. Well, in April, she received a letter from the Colorado State Board of Nursing. The board had reviewed the circumstances of her suspension from the Crest Haven placement, a review that had been initiated by Park's office as part of the investigative record, and had issued a formal finding that the suspension had been retaliatory in nature and without clinical basis, and that her student record would be amended accordingly. The letter used careful institutional language to describe something that translated, in plain terms, to, "You were right, they were wrong, and the record now says so." She read it 3 times. Not because it was complicated, but because the specific sensation of a written record finally aligning with what had actually happened was something she wanted to sit with long enough to fully register. She put the letter on her kitchen table and went to work. The trauma center in Colorado Springs was having a high-acuity Thursday. 2 MVAs in the first hour of her shift, a pediatric case that required all of the attending's attention and most of the charge nurses, and a waiting room that had backed up to the point where the triage nurse was managing increasingly compressed timelines. Sara spent the first 3 hours of the shift doing what was needed, running labs, managing the backup, talking a 19-year-old through the wait for his laceration repair, with the steady patience of someone who had not lost the capacity to be present with a scared person even when everything around her was moving fast. During the brief pause that came around hour 4, when the MVA patients were stabilized and the waiting room had breathed out slightly, the attending physician, a woman named Dr. Lim, 50-ish, with the efficient precision of someone who had been doing emergency medicine for long enough to have lost the performance of urgency without losing the urgency itself, stopped beside Sara at the nurse's station and said, without looking up from her chart, "The family in Bay 3. You talked them down." "The mother was escalating," Sara said. "Her daughter's going to be fine. She needed someone to stay with that instead of moving past it." Dr. Lim looked up. "You've done this before." It was not quite a question. Sara thought about every version of the answer, the abbreviated version, the deflecting version, the version that redirected to something else. She was tired of those versions, not dramatically tired, not with any particular moment of decision. Just done with them in the quiet way that sometimes happened when a thing has run its course. "Yes," she said. Dr. Lim held her gaze for a moment with the expression of someone who has just received a piece of information they intend to remember. "Okay," she said, and went back to her chart. Sara looked at the waiting room. The 19-year-old with the laceration had found a phone charger somewhere and was texting. The triage nurse was managing the check-in line with the practiced efficiency of someone running on her 3rd cup of coffee and her 20th year of doing exactly this. The overhead fluorescents were doing what hospital fluorescents always did, flattening everything slightly, making the tired look more tired and the sick look more pale. She had been invisible here for exactly as long as she'd let herself be invisible, which was less time than at Crest Haven, because she was less willing to be invisible than she had been in November. and she wasn't sure yet how to be fully visible without the old reflexes pulling her back, but she was working on it. There was a woman in her early 60s in the waiting room who had been there for 40 minutes and whose color Sara did not like. Not alarmingly wrong, not wrong enough that the triage screen would have flagged it, but specifically wrong in the way that Sara had learned to read at a distance, the subtle translation of the body's private work into visible information for anyone paying close enough attention to see it. She walked over to the triage nurse. "The woman in the green jacket," she said quietly, "row 2. I'd like to run a BP on her." The triage nurse looked at Sara. She was experienced enough to know what it meant when someone with Sara's particular quality of attention flagged something quietly and without drama. "I'll get the cuff," she said. Sara walked toward the waiting room. The woman in the green jacket looked up when Sara approached, with the expression of someone who has been waiting long enough to have stopped expecting attention. "Hi," Sara said. "I'm Sara. I'd like to check your blood pressure, if that's okay." The woman blinked. "I'm just here for my knee," she said. "I know. This'll just take a second." Sara sat in the chair beside her and took the cuff from the triage nurse who had appeared. "Can you tell me how long you've had the knee pain?" "About a week. The swelling started. And the chest tightness? When did that start?" The woman looked at her. "I didn't," she began. "Your color," Sara said simply, without alarming her. "You've been rubbing your left shoulder since I walked over." A silence. "Maybe an hour," the woman said. "I thought it was from carrying groceries." Sara put her hand on the woman's wrist. Her pulse was off. "Okay," Sara said calmly, in the tone she used when calm was the most useful thing she could give someone. "Let's get you to a room. The knee is going to wait a few minutes." She looked up at the triage nurse, who was already moving, already radioing, already doing the cascade of small, efficient actions that were the actual texture of emergency medicine. Not the drama, not the clarity of the television version, but the repetitive, careful work of people paying attention in rooms where paying attention was the difference. Sara looked back at the woman in the green jacket, who was frightened now and trying not to show it. "I'm not going anywhere," Sara told her. "You're in the right place." She meant it. For the first time in a long time, she meant it without reservation. There was a version of her life in which she had not walked into Crest Haven Regional in September, in which she had found a different placement, farther from what she was running from, somewhere the particular combination of her training and her capacity for attention would have been less inconvenient to the people who needed things to stay quiet. She would have noticed less. She would have been safer for longer in the careful smallness she'd built around herself. 41 families, minimum, would have waited longer for an answer. Some would never have gotten one. She didn't think she was the only person who could have done what she'd done. She didn't believe in that kind of story about herself, the singular necessary hero. The truth was messier. She'd been in the right place with the wrong invisibility for long enough that the wrong invisibility had failed, and what was underneath it had turned out to be exactly what the situation required. But here was what she'd learned in all of it, in the notebook, and the parking lot, and the cold highway, and the federal courtroom, and the Thursday afternoons with Dr. Reyes, and the quiet adjustment of trying to be present in a room without first calculating whether her presence was welcome. The things you've been through don't have to be behind you to be useful. You don't have to be finished with the hard parts of yourself to do good work. You can be in the middle of it, still working it out, still some days more tired than you want to admit, still a person with jagged edges and reflexes you didn't choose, and still be exactly the right person for the moment in front of you. She had spent 3 years trying to become a different person, quieter and smaller, and less likely to walk into a situation and see what was wrong with it, and feel compelled to do something about that. She had not succeeded, which used to feel like failure, and had started to feel like something else. The woman in the green jacket let Sara take her arm to guide her toward the triage door, and she gripped it a little tighter than she probably intended to, the grip of someone who was more frightened than they wanted to admit in a room full of strangers. And Sara matched the pressure, not pulling, just present, steady, and walked with her through the door. Behind them, the waiting room continued. The fluorescents hummed. The triage nurse's radio crackled. The 19-year-old with the laceration had fallen asleep in his chair, phone finally dead, head tilted back. Sara did not